Okay, so the main thing is that in relation to palm oil, for almost 50 years, we've been hearing that saturated fatty acids are not good for health, that saturated fatty acids are problematic in terms of cholesterol, and therefore they may have an impact on heart disease. However, over the last 40, 50 years, our thinking has actually changed quite a bit, because we realize that saturated fatty acids, there are many types of saturated fatty acids. Some of them are more problematic than others. And then, of course, saturated fatty acids are not the only fat in the diet. There are other types of fatty acids in the diet, like monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. When it comes to palm oil, because palm oil is about, let's say, half saturated and half unsaturated, people sort of focus on the saturated aspect. They forget that it is unsaturated. And then they do not pay attention to the types of saturated fatty acids that are in palm oil. And there's a lot of data that says that the types of saturated fatty acids that are present in palm oil generally are not a problem. In fact, one of the saturated fatty acids that's in palm oil, palmitic acid, your body actually makes. So, you could always make the argument that if nature has made a system which makes a specific fatty acid and that's present in a specific oil, obviously it's not going to be as detrimental, or it's not going to be problematic, because the body will have ways of regulating. So in terms of the misconceptions, going back to your original question, we've always thought of saturated fatty acids as being one entity. They're not one entity, they're a mixture. And our original thinking on saturated fat, what it does to cholesterol, has changed over the years, because we have to look and see what saturated fat does to LDL cholesterol, which is your bad cholesterol, as well as the good cholesterol, the HDL. And saturated fatty acids do raise the HDL cholesterol. Some of them affect the bad cholesterol, but overall, if you look at what they do to the bad and good, generally saturated fatty acids are not an issue. Certainly not in relation to what we thought of them maybe 50 years ago. And palm oil, yes, it has saturated fatty acids, but the types of saturates are different. And then the effects that palm oil itself has on cholesterol, several studies have been done comparing palm oil directly with something like olive oil or canola oil, which in the public's mind are supposed to be good oils. And in those studies, palm oil and olive oil, palm oil and canola, behave exactly the same way. These are fatty acids that are produced by partial hydrogenation of liquid oil, so these are sort of man-made. They're the ones that are the worst in terms of what they do to heart disease risk. They affect the bad cholesterol in a negative manner, they affect the good cholesterol in a negative manner, and they increase heart disease risk. You will get these types of trans fatty acids, which are man-made. We can call them industrial trans fatty acids. Those are there in processed foods. So anytime you take a liquid oil and you do something to make it hard, generally you would pass hydrogen through it, so you're partially hydrogenating. If you partially hydrogenate, you generate trans fatty acids. Processed foods, baked goods, it obviously depends on the country, because now different countries have different food scenarios. For example, in North America, in margarines, mayonnaise, shortenings, that's where trans fatty acids were found. However, our legislation has changed over the years, so the trans content is going down. It's not down to where we would like. In some parts of Europe, they've actually banned trans fatty acids. Now, Malaysia generally probably won't have a problem with trans, because you have palm oil, and palm oil does not contain any trans fatty acids. So you do not need to partially hydrogenate to create a solid fat, as you already have one which occurs naturally and is semi-solid. So the Malaysian diet, the exact trans content is probably much, much lower than it is in the United States and Europe. So trans are definitely the worst, and rest assured you're okay with palm oil, because palm oil doesn't contain any trans fatty acids. The other fatty acids are basically polyunsaturates and monounsaturates, and they have generally been considered to be beneficial, often because they may be replacing trans, or in some studies they may have beneficial effects by themselves. In fact, that's actually true for saturated fatty acids. We've as we mentioned before, saturated fatty acids vary in their effects on the good cholesterol, and yes, saturated fatty acids will impact good cholesterol. So in terms of CHD, trans are definitely the worst. In terms of finding beneficial effects, I think at the moment the consensus is simply if you remove trans, whatever you have is going to be a step in the right direction.
Okay.
Obviously, it's going to depend on how much butter and how much margarine you actually have in your diet. Now, if you're just using butter in the morning to spread on your toast or margarine, as far as I'm concerned, that's probably not going to be an issue. However, if you use appreciable quantities, let's say because you're also using them in baked goods, you're doing, cooking at home, generally the softer margarines are more desirable than the hard margarines. In terms of a direct comparison between butter and margarine, there are studies, some of them which show that butter is worse, and there are studies that show that margarine is worse because it depends on the actual fatty acid composition of the two. But going back to the original thing, if the quantity is simply the 1 teaspoon that you're using on your toast in the morning, both of them are probably okay. However, if you are choosing margarine, you should definitely go for the more soft variety as opposed to the hardened margarines, which potentially may have trans fatty acids. Again, that's not going to be the case in Malaysia because they'll probably have palm oil. But certainly in North America, you try to avoid the margarines which are harder and go for the softer varieties.